Hello guys, welcome back to the Digital Aviator channel and to another tutorial video. This time we're going to talk about traffic patterns. So traffic patterns are procedures to arrive or depart at an airfield, usually for a specific runway. So those are very common when you are going to land at an airfield and going to depart. They are kind of a standardized way to make sure that all the traffic around an airport is doing the same thing, is flying the same pattern. But another great reason to learn traffic patterns, is to practice takeoffs and landings. Because you can actually use a traffic pattern to take off, turn around and land at the same runway. And that's basically the shortest and still organized way possible. And that is what I have used in order to learn landing, because landing is of course the most difficult thing in controlling the plane. So you want to practice that. And by just taking off, turning around and landing again, that is the shortest way possible. You can do many takeoffs and landings. So that is what we're going to do in this video. We're going to practice our takeoffs and landings by doing a traffic pattern. So let me just zoom out a little bit. I'm at an airfield called French Valley, which is to the east of Los Angeles. And I'm holding short of runway 36, so we're facing north. So it just makes it easy on our heading indicator which direction we're flying. And a traffic pattern is basically as follows. We take off from a runway, usually one that points into the wind. So the wind will be coming from the north towards the south in this case, right? We would always want to take off with a headwind, otherwise I would have picked the other side of the runway. And then we would just take off. And we would start climbing, of course. And at some point we have reached about 500 feet above the ground. At that point I will make a 90-degree turn left. So we're now flying this direction towards the west. First we're flying north, then I'm flying straight west. Of course it will change if you're flying west or east or north or south for different runways, but in this case the runway points to 360 degrees, that's to the north. So at 500 feet we are still climbing. I'm going to make a climbing left turn, and then we have reached about 1,000 feet above the ground. So then I will make another 90-degree left turn, and now we're flying to the south. So we're flying in the opposite direction of the runway. We're flying alongside of the runway. And then at some point we will start to descend again, usually about when you cross over the start of the runway, when the start of the runway is directly to your left. We start to descend, and then we'll make a left 90-degree turn, and then another left 90-degree turn to arrive back on final to land at the runway. So this is a pattern. It's basically a rectangular shape, and I'm going to show you a PDF that you can download. I'll provide a link in the description below. This is created by the FAA, the American Federal Aviation Association, and they have created this airplane flying handbook. You can just Google for that. I'll also provide a link to this document or the whole airplane flying manual in the description below the video, so you can download it. But this is a nice document that just describes these patterns, and I'm just going to use it for a couple of diagrams they have here. So this here is the diagram I just described. So in this example they actually have runway 36, and as you can see they're going to take off, and each of these parts of this rectangle of the pattern has a name. This is called the departure leg. So then once we cross about 500 feet above the ground, we make a left crosswind turn. So now we're flying crosswind. They're not actually drawing an upward line here, but in reality you would still be climbing up until 1,000 feet. And again, this is above the ground, not as displayed on your altimeter. That will be above sea level. But we want to be 1,000 feet above the ground, so you have to add 1,000 feet above the ground elevation. We'll check that out in a moment. But then once we reach 1,000 feet, we'll level off, make another left turn, and then we're flying downwind. And the reason why it's called downwind is, as you can see, they have drawn a little arrow here with the wind. So the wind will be coming, down the runway, basically. The departure leg is also sometimes called the upwind. And then, as you can see, once the runway is about 45 degrees behind us, we are already descending. I'm going to make my base turn and then a final turn to land back at the runway. So that will be a left-hand traffic pattern. We make left turns. The rectangle is on the left side of the runway you're going to take off from. Of course, if we're flying on the downwind, the runway will be on our left, right? So that is what that means. So we're making left turns. The rectangle is on the left, and on downwind the runway is on your left side. Now sometimes you want to do a right hand pattern, and this is actually depicted on the charts. We'll check out the chart of the airfield in a moment. But by default you want to use left patterns unless otherwise specified. And the reason to do right hand patterns is there might be a village over here on the left that you don't want to fly over, or there might be terrain. or other obstacles. So in that case you would do a right-hand pattern. That is depicted on the charts. We'll check out where you can find that in a second. But it works exactly the same, but then your turns are right-hand turns. And the rectangle is on the right, and if you're on the downwind, the runway would be on your right. So that is what a pattern looks like. So just to recap, we'll take off, and we'll make either a left or a right pattern, and then we'll turn 90 degrees crosswind, keep climbing to about 1,000 feet above the ground, make another right turn downwind, just fly alongside of the runway. And then once we pass around here, I would say, when the runway start is perpendicular directly to our right or our left, we start descending, and then we make a base turn 90 degrees, and then a final turn again 90 degrees back on the track of the runway. So the reason why you want to do a pattern is so that we don't have planes going crisscross through each other, doing different things, and that of course can cause a mid-air collision if planes are just flying crisscross through each other. But this basically forces planes to fly in the same direction, and if you're flying in the same direction, it's quite difficult to meet a plane that's going completely opposite of you, in the opposite direction. So that is of course for safety. But as you can see, we can just do a full pattern, not leave it, not depart, and we can just come back in for a landing. And that's actually done very often, just for some practice. But yeah, usually it's meant for departure. So as you can see in this example, they have some lines here for departure. So either you want to depart straight out, or you make a departing turn after you cross about 500 feet. Or if you're going to enter the pattern, you would want to do that on the downwind. So you will come in on the downwind at about a 45 degree entry, make a turn to get on the downwind, kind of as if you're merging onto a highway or onto a road, and then you just complete the pattern back to final. So in this video we'll just check out the full pattern. We'll see how we can use it for practice and landings, just get familiar with it. In the next video I'm going to show you how we can depart it and how you can enter it. And we'll also talk about communication, radio communication in traffic patterns in the next video. Anyway, let's hop back into the simulator, and I'll go back to our plane. So we're back in our Cessna 152, and here we are. And let's just check this out. So, well, before we get started, let me just show you this website. This is called SkyVector, and I've already made a video explaining everything about these charts. You don't have to learn that if you don't want. I mean, it's really, really nerdy, complex stuff. I already have made a live stream that you can find on my channel explaining all of this stuff. But one thing that you should be able to do is find the airport on the map. I mean, it's just a map, find the airport. And here we have French Valley, that's the airport where I'm at. And on the bottom, if there is a right pattern, they would say that for which runway it is. So as you can see, for French Valley, they have a right pattern for runway 36. Now, some airfields don't have right patterns. We might just find one around here. Let's see. Most of them have a right pattern for some runways, but not always. I can't actually find one that doesn't have a right pattern right now. Oh, here we have one. So Paso Robles, as you can see, doesn't have RP and then a number of a runway. So all of the patterns for this airfield are left patterns. That's the default. But here at French Valley, you can see RP right pattern 36. So disregard all of the other information if you don't know that, but that is how you find whether or not you need to fly a left or a right-hand pattern. So that means that, well, we are here at runway 36, so I need to be making right turns. Otherwise, if it wasn't specified RP36 on the chart, we would be making left turns. Alright, so let's just get going. Of course, we have already done in the tutorials before how we take off, how we prepare for takeoff and everything. So I'm just going to put my mixture to full rich. And I'll turn my strobe lights on and my landing lights on. And my altimeter is already set to alt mode, so that's great. So let's just get onto the runway. And like I said, I will not be talking about communication. We'll do that in the next video. And Microsoft Flight Simulator has a pretty okay ATC system that actually works with untowered field traffic pattern communication. Now, traffic pattern is actually something that you always do at an untowered field, but you don't have to do that necessarily at the towered field, because of the towered field, ATC will give you instructions. Very often they will give you the instruction to fly a right crosswind departure or so. So then you would depart on the right crosswind. But we'll talk about those kind of communications in the next video. Alright, so here we are on the runway. I verified that my heading indicator indeed points the runway heading, so north. My compass is pointing north. My engine instruments are looking good. So I think we're ready to go. So just to recap, we'll just take off like normal, and then 500 feet above the ground I want to make my right hand turn onto that crosswind leg. So if we look at my altimeter, this is now of course the ground altitude, which is about 1,300 feet. Let's round it off like that. So 500 feet will be 1,800 feet, right? So that's what I'm going to wait for until I make my right hand turn. And then we are flying on that crosswind turn to the right, still climbing, and I want to be at least 1,000 feet above the ground before I go to the downwind. So that will be at 2,300 feet. So those are the numbers I'm going to keep in my mind. Right. So let's just get rid of the parking brake, and we'll apply full power slowly. Stay on the runway center line, and we'll just accelerate. So this is of course just the same as any order takeoff. We just are flying in specific directions in the next part after we've taken off. So we're accelerating. Here's 40 knots and 50 knots, 55 knots. We will rotate the nose up and we are in the air. So I'm just going to trim the plane so that we are flying at around 75 knots. And now we are climbing. Keep an eye on your heading indicator every now and then to make sure we're still flying in the runway heading. So I still want to be flying north. And we can see our altimeter is going up. So now we're just flying here. And in the real world, or if you're flying online, you want to be looking outside for all the traffic. You might see someone flying on the downwind over there. So just keep an eye on where the other traffic is. Because still, of course, you can collide with other planes. You just still have to look out for them. So here we're coming up to about 1,800 feet, which is about now. And I'm going to make a turn to the right, to look to the right, and then I'm making a turn. And we're still climbing, so I'm still going to maintain 75 knots at full power, not re-trimming or anything. So we should still be climbing, but I'm going to make my 90-degree turn to the right. And I know, of course, that we were flying north earlier, so 90 degrees to the right will be east. And you can also see on my heading indicator, we have this little white notch here. Well, north I want to be 90 degrees to the left. So north is right here on my left, east is right here on my right, or in front of me. So now we're flying east, and I'm still climbing. And we're almost at 1,300 feet here. So then I'm going to level off, and I'm going to slowly power down. So reduce the throttle to about 2100 RPM, around here. Lower the nose, fly level. And before I'm going to trim the plane, I'm just going to turn right. So we'll make that downwind turn. So now I want to be flying south. And I'm not trimming the plane just yet, because that's kind of hard to do during a turn. So we'll just trim the plane as I'm on the downwind, if I need to. And what you're aiming for is about 80 to 90 knots. So I'm going to slightly power up. And now we're flying south. I overshot it slightly, but that's fine. So now I'm going to see if I have to trim the plane. So of course I've made a full video on how to trim the plane. And I feel that I'm flying nice and level right now, and I don't have to control the plane. And now we're flying perpendicular to the runway. So now I'm just waiting until we kind of cross the start of the runway, when it's directly to my right. And of course, if we would be making a left pattern, that would be directly to my left. And at that moment, I'm going to lower the power even more to about 1600, 1500 RPM to descend. So far, so good. And you can see at about 2100 RPM, we maintain about 90 knots, 82 or 90 knots. There's the runway start directly to my right, so I'm going to lower the power more to about 1600 RPM. That of course makes the plane start to descend. And I'm going to trim the nose up again, or at least manually move the nose up, because I want to descend but also slow down to about 70 knots. So we're just descending here, and I'm going to slow down to 70 knots, and I'm going to set my flaps to 10 degrees as we do that. That will help us slow down while we are descending. And now I'm just going to trim the plane so that we maintain 70 knots as I descend. Again, if you're having trouble still trimming the plane, watch that video again about trimming. And now the runway is about 45 degrees behind me. So we have descended a little bit. I feel we can make our base turn. So we'll make another 90-degree turn right. So now we will be aiming towards the west. And this is of course why it's great to have runways pointing straight to the north or the south, because these 90 degrees turns always line up with north, east, south or west. But of course it's not always the case. If you would be taking off runway 02, then you will be taking off 20 degrees. And then of course you have to manually calculate 90 degrees on top of that. Okay, so here we are on the base leg. I'm going to add flaps 20 degrees now. Still maintain about 70 knots, 65 knots is about right. And just slightly maybe retrim the plane if you need to. And I'm just going to keep an eye on the runway, and when I feel that I need to turn to the right, I'm going to do so. So just a little bit longer. We don't want to overshoot, so I'm just going to start turning right about now. A little bit on the slow side. We don't necessarily need to be 60 knots right now. Of course, we have about 20 knots to spare until I'm at about 40 knots. That's about my stall speed here. Let's see. Oh, slightly overshot the runway there, so I'm just going to make a slightly steeper turn. But yeah, you don't want to get too slow, because like I said, during landing and takeoff, that is where most accidents happen, mostly because of a lack of speed. So let's get back on the runway track. I'm going to slow down to 60 knots again. That's going to be my final approach speed. Now you can see maybe those 4 red lights here on the left. I'll talk about those in a moment, because those can actually be a huge help. Not all runways have those, but I will talk about them in a moment. So we are at flaps 20 degrees, trimmed pretty well for 60 knots. That's about the trim I want to land with. That will also be roughly our takeoff trim. If we just take a look over here, that's the takeoff trim set again. That's pretty nice. So now I'm just aiming for those white blocks on the runway, those second white blocks, 2 of them, and we're going idle throttle. I have made the runway, so we'll idle throttle, and then I'm going to flare, level off just over the ground, and land the plane. So bring the nose up, there we go. So we've landed. I'm going to bring the flaps up immediately, and you can stop if you want, or we can go back to the center line and apply full power again. And you should already be at takeoff trim. That's very important to check here. If you're not, do that before you power up again. But this is here, what we're doing here is called a touch and go. So I touch it down on the ground and I just apply full power, and in just a couple of seconds we are back in the air, because we already had, of course, a lot of speed. And this is how you can practice your takeoffs and landings very quickly, because we can just land and take off immediately. So it takes about 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes to do a full pattern. And that is how long it takes you to do a takeoff and landing. So if you're still struggling with landing, if you're still struggling with takeoff, if you're struggling with trimming or turning the plane or managing your power, patterns do all of it. So you can not only use it as a procedure that you have to do in the real world, of course, if you are going to fly at an airport, but you can also use it for practice. So let's do another one. I'm going to make a 90-degree turn right, because we're at 1,800 feet. Still full power, no flaps. Of course, you want to get rid of your flaps before you take off again. So as you touch down on the ground, flaps up, make sure the trim was indeed set for takeoff, and then you just apply full power, go back to the center line if you were off, and try again, or well, do it again. So we're flying east, and we'll just do another pattern. Now you saw those 4 red lights on the left side of the runway. We'll see those again in a moment once we come back for landing. Those are called PAPI lights, and let me explain what those do as I turn to the downwind. But first let me level off and lower down the throttle to about 2100 RPM, and we'll make a 90-degree turn to the right. So those PAPI lights tell you if you're too high or too low, and I'm going to demonstrate that the next time we turn to final, so we can see them. But let me just first turn to the south and make sure the plane is trimmed. There we go. So those lights can change from red to white. Now there's 4 of them. If we see 4 red lights on the start of the runway, so they will be on the left of the start of the runway. If you see 4 red lights, that means I'm way too low. If I see 3 red lights and 1 white light, that means I'm slightly too low. If I see 2 red lights and 2 white lights, that means I'm exactly on the correct approach angle to land on the runway. If I see 3 white lights and 1 red light, that means I'm slightly too high, and 4 white lights means I'm way too high. So you want to aim for 2 red lights and 2 white lights, and then you are on a correct angle to glide towards the runway. You're not coming down too high, you're not coming down too low, and that's what those PAPI lights are for. Now not all runways have them. Sometimes really small airfields don't have them. Let me start descending here. Lower the throttle, bring the nose down, and I'm going to go flaps 10 degrees. That helps to slow down to about 70 knots. I will retrim the plane for 70 knots if I need to. But those PAPI lights are not at all airports, only at the slightly larger ones. Sometimes the small ones have them as well. This is a pretty small airport and it still has those PAPI lights. But those are a huge help to kind of see if you're getting in too high or too low. but not all airports have those. Alright, so let's just fly slightly bit more, and then I'm going to turn base about here. Again, maintaining about 70 knots right here, not too low. You don't want to get anywhere below 60 knots until you actually approach the runway. Just so that we have a nice buffer of speed, we still can slow down and still fly. I mean, we still have about 30 knots of usable airspeed to us. Make sure we are still descending, so just lower my power a bit. And now I'm going to go flaps 20 degrees. And then I will slow down to about 60-65 knots. Trim for that. And adjust my power for descent, and use the trim at the pitch for airspeed. So here in a second we will see those puppy lights. Of course they aim only towards the final. I can already see them. I can see two... Oh, now my strut is in the way, so we'll check them out in a moment. But I saw 2 red lights and 2 white lights, so I was already correct. So let's turn towards the final. There it is. And you can really start to see those lights once we get close, but now you can see I have 3 red lights and 1 white light on the left side of the runway. So I'm going to just level off here just a little bit until one of them turns to white. There we go. So now one of those lights turned to white. Now we have 2 white lights and 2 red lights. So let me just descend way too quick. And now you can see one of them changed back to red. Whoops. And now all of them are red. So now I'm way too low. And I'm going to fly level here a moment. And then we'll see them change back. So one of them is now white, 2 of them are white, 3 of them, 4 of them. Now I'm way too high. So let me go idle throttle again and see if I can still fix that. But that is a tool there that tells you if you're too low or too high. There we go. Now we have 2 red lights, 2 white lights, and that means I'm on the correct approach angle towards the runway. Let's slow down a bit more. I'm a little bit fast. And once you get really close to the runway, right about now, just disregard the puppy lights because we have made the runway anyway. So we can just land on the runway and we don't have to look at those puppy lights again. But from a distance, those can be a nice help, especially at night. So there we go, we'll land again. And we'll bring the flaps up. And this time I'm just going to come to a complete stop. And we'll leave the runway here on our left. If I can slow down before that, I think we can make a little turn here. A little bit overshot, but it doesn't matter too much. Anyway, so this is how we do a traffic pattern. So traffic patterns are procedures, again, that we use to arrive and depart at an airport. We'll talk about that in the next video and also talk about the communications we'll do with traffic patterns. But as you can see, we can also just stay in a pattern and do a complete lap and then use them for practice. So in the next video I'm just going to taxi back to the start of the runway and we'll talk about how we depart and enter a traffic pattern. And there's a couple of ways to do that. And then after that we'll talk about communication.